I just want to go over the way that Photoshop works and the way that your camera works as far as the files. Can you guys see this PowerPoint that says pixels?
Yeah.
Okay, so on your notes page, if you'll just write pixels, and we're going to be talking about Photoshop and pixels here. Okay, so you might want to write today's date. All right, let me just check if I started recording this too. I think I did. Everything, yep, becomes so automatic now. All righty, so pixels. In Photoshop, your images are made up of pixels. Photoshop, the whole program of Photoshop is made up of pixels. So in Photoshop, anytime you draw something, anytime you paint something, it is made up of pixels. And pixels are little tiny squares that make up your picture. So here's what we call pixels. Programs that use pixels are called bitmaps or raster programs. So Photoshop is a bitmap or a raster program. It means it's made up of these pixels. Bitmaps is kind of like a map. When you lay out your pixels into a design like this, it creates an image. So they call this a bitmap. It's kind of like the pixels are mapped out. So your images are made up of pixels. In your camera, when you take a picture, because it's digital photography, the image sensor turns all the information that comes into your camera into pixels and into a file that goes into your computer. So these little pixels are solid blocks of color, and they're kind of like laid out and mapped out. That's why it's called bitmaps. They're laid and mapped out to create the details in your photos. So they're just purely solid color squares that are just mapped out. And when you zoom in, you can start to see the squares. But on the screen, it kind of has the illusion of smooth and realistic photographs because they're so tiny that they just kind of all blend together. So your camera, Photoshop, your TV screen, your computer monitor, those are all made up of little dots of colors that create the images. So going back to this one, this is a very low resolution file because this would be made up of very few pixels. So this is a 3 pixels by 4 pixels, very tiny file. Now this one, if I counted, I could see like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is probably like 30 by 20 or something pixels. So when you start counting pixels, you get into like the resolution of a file. Like you might hear the word resolution, or like you've probably heard like the term a high res photo or a low res photo. That specifically refers to, are there a lot of pixels that make up the image? When there's a lot of pixels that make up the image, it becomes a very high quality image. You can print it really largely. When it's a low res image, like something you find online, it's made up of very few pixels. So it directly relates to how like big you can print it. If something's low res and made up of very few pixels, you start to see the pixels when you enlarge it. And then like if you try to print it, usually you can see the pixels when you print it. So ideally, you never want to like see pixels in your image, you know, when you're printing it and when you're displaying it. You want it to look smooth. So the smaller you make it, like the less obvious it is. But as soon as you try to enlarge something, you'll start to see those pixels, especially if if the image has very low pixels or low res, you'll start to see those right away. Okay, so the advantages of pixels in programs like Photoshop are they move, like you can paint in Photoshop and it kind of gives the illusion of a realistic paintbrush. It has a more natural sense of feeling and of look. So like you can like choose watercolor brushes and oil paint brushes and things like that when you're getting into digital art. In this class, we may do a little bit of digital art, but like painting and things like that. But a lot of artists, graphic designers and stuff paint in Photoshop all the time because it's very realistic. And it's very realistic because of the pixels. Pixels actually allow you to get a lot of detail. And that's why with photographs, photographs are realistic, right? So, and they just have a ton of detail in them. So those little squares actually allow you to do that. The other nice thing about pixels is they're in a very universal file format. So like most things you create in Photoshop, you can see on most computers or on your phone and things like that, because pixels are widely recognized on most computers, phones, and other things like that. So being that it's a bitmap and it's raster, it's made up of pixels, it's easily accessible. Where other programs like for graphic design, when we work in Adobe Illustrator, that's made of vector, and that like you have to have special programs to read those kind of things. So as long as you guys know your picture's made up of pixels, they're little colors squared. Let's talk about resolution. I want you to write down the word resolution and kind of write down just a brief definition of this. Like you can simplify it if you want. But it's the number of pixels contained on a display monitor, in a file, in a picture. So it's the number of pixels in your file, basically. Could be the number of pixels on your screen or on your monitor. So, and it's expressed, you know, you count the number going across horizontally and the number going down vertically. And the sharpness of your image depends on the resolution and the size of the monitor, or if you're printing it, the size of your print. So these are the most important things on this page, the underline thing and this. You always want to set your camera to a large quality file. In your camera, if you go into the menu, you have the option, the first tab, it says quality, and you can choose L or M or S, which is large, medium, or small. So large quality gives you it gives you a large file size with every picture you take. It turns the picture into a large file, which has more pixels. It's higher quality versus like a small format picture or small quality is made up of less pixels. So you can't print it as large. You can't display it on a monitor as large. However, like a small file quality will allow you to like take more pictures on your SD cards. Like you can get a lot more pictures because they're smaller file sizes. They don't take up as much space. So when we're working with large file sizes, they take up a lot of space, but you're going to have a lot of pixels. You'll have a really high resolution, which in turn will give you better prints. Also, when you save in Photoshop, and I'll review that with you again today, you always want to save it at the highest quality after editing. So always choose the highest resolution option or the best quality, because anytime you don't, you're reducing the number of pixels that are in your picture. And when you reduce the number of pixels, you reduce the size of the print you can print, you reduce the quality of the image. So in your notes, will you please write more pixels, or like maybe a arrow up, pixels equals a higher resolution, is better quality or higher quality, has a larger file size, but you can also print larger. So it's just important for you to know that. So I want to show you guys an example in Photoshop. Okay, so I took this picture offline of this dog. When I zoom in, do you see how quickly you can see those pixels? Now, because I can practically see the pixels when it's just not even zoomed in, that means it's a low resolution file. It's made up of very few pixels. I probably cannot print this very large without seeing the pixels. And your goal is to not ever see the pixels when you print it. So this is a very low res image. It was taken offline. Usually images taken offline are low resolution or made up of few pixels. And that's because they are smaller files, so they load faster. If all the images on a website were high res and really big files, they would take forever to load and they would take up a lot of space. The other thing is, you guys, you can get away with viewing a lower res picture or a lower quality picture on a monitor way better than you can get away with it when you print it. When you print it, you're going to right away see all the pixels. But when you're on a monitor, it's much more forgiving and you can view things at a lower resolution. So right now, this picture here, if I look at its size, and if you go in Photoshop, you can go to image and then image size. This is made up of 256 pixels by 256 pixels. The width times the height in inches, like that directly relates to how big you can print this. Okay, so it's telling me right now to be printed. I'm going to actually change this number here. If I wanted to print this at a high quality, this would only print out at less than an inch by an inch. Because for printing, there's standard quality measures for printing. The resolution for printing has to be a 300 pixels per square inch. So in every inch of your picture, there's 300 little pixels jammed in there. And that would make it high enough quality that you could print it like at a high quality. That's like the standard industry, or the industry standard for printing is 300 pixels per square inch. So in every inch of your picture, there's 300 there crammed in there. So before, this was showing me 72 pixels per square inch. And actually 72 pixels per square inch is the quality standard for seeing something on a monitor or on a display. So you can get away with showing this on a display at about 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. But as soon as I go to print it, this only has enough pixels to print in high quality at 0.8 by 0.8 inches. So if we look at my little thing here, I did write that down here for you guys. So if you can just write down. So this is for high quality. It really depends on if it's printed or displayed. So if you just write down for printing, you want 300 pixels per square inch or dots per square inch. The printers sometimes call it dots per square inch. On a monitor, you can have it as low as 72 pixels per square inch. The reason that you need to know that is just because this is kind of really general knowledge that most photographers know, because if they go to send out one of their pictures to be printed in a 20 by 30 really big print, if they didn't take their pictures at a really high quality to begin with, they're never going to be able to print it that large. They have to make sure they start with a high quality file size that takes a lot of pixels to begin with, and then they can print it much larger. But now if that same photographer wants to put the picture on his website really big, or on her website really big, you could do that because the screen only requires 72 pixels per square inch to look high quality. As soon as you print it though, it's a lot different. So going back to Photoshop, let's see. I think I closed my other. Okay, this splash picture I took with my camera. Look at how much further I have to zoom in. Like I still can't see the pixels, and I've been zooming in for a while. I can start to see them now. And that's because I took them with a high quality camera. If I look at this image size, it's 2000 by 3000 pixels. The other one was 200 by 200. So it directly look at, I can get a much larger print now, a 6 by 10, really high quality print with this picture. Because I took it with a high quality camera and I've saved it in a high quality way. And I mean, some printers will print a little like lower quality than 300 pixels per square inch. Like I might be able to get like 11 by 14 or something printed from this and it'll look just fine. It just wouldn't be the top of the line quality. So the standard is 300 pixels per square inch. Most websites now, or places when you go to order prints will tell you, they'll give you a warning if your image is too low resolution. Like they'll say you have to pick a smaller size, your picture won't work. They'll give you a warning for that. So I usually rely on that warning. Every picture you take, you don't have to go in and like look at the size. I just wanted to show you guys that. As long as your camera's set to L quality, all of yours were when I gave them to you. So unless you've changed it, they'll be on large quality. And then we're almost done here. I just want to show you, like, this is like a painting done in Photoshop. Look at how it really looks like an oil painting or something. It's very, very detailed brushes if you decide to do digital art in Photoshop. But if you do a painting in Photoshop, you want to make sure you start with a large enough canvas for what you want to print. So if I could paint this in Photoshop on the screen, it would look fine. And then if I go to print it, it may be too small to print as large as I want it. So when you start an actual painting in Photoshop, for those of you that like to paint in Photoshop or do digital paint, you want to make sure you start with like a 11 by 14 inch document that's 300 pixels per square inch so that you know you can print it nice and large, or a 20 by 30 inch document that's 300 pixels per square inch. So it becomes very important when you're working on the computer to kind of understand that stuff. Okay, and then this is the file formats that we're going to use, so make sure that you write these down. A PSD, it looks like this in your computer, this little blue file. That's a Photoshop file. So if you just in your notes write .psd, Photoshop file, it's made up of pixels. These all are made up of pixels. The cool thing about a Photoshop file is it saves your layers and it doesn't compress your image. So like a lot of file types, like a JPEG is a photo file, but it will compress your image. If you start editing a JPEG a lot and save it over and over and over, your picture will get more degraded and lower quality every time you save it. So with a Photoshop file, when you're working in Photoshop, instead of saving it as a JPEG, you can save it as a Photoshop file if you're not done with it. Then when you're done editing it, then I go and I save it as like a JPEG so that you can view it on other things. So the problem with a Photoshop file is you can only see a Photoshop file if you have Photoshop. If you go and take that file and put it on another computer, it won't work unless you have Photoshop on that computer. Whereas if you save your image as a JPEG, when you're done, you can take your edited photo and see it on your phone and on anything. So if I'm working on something for a long time, like if I'm working for doing a lot of touch-ups on a portrait and I have to walk away, I'll save it as a Photoshop file. But then when I come back, when I'm done and I'm ready and I think, oh, it looks pretty good, I think I'm done, I'll save it as a JPEG. And that way I can send it to the printer and the printer recognizes a JPEG. The website I can upload it to recognizes a JPEG. But a JPEG in its nature, it compresses a file. It gets rid of information to make the file more compact. So it's not like the best quality for your image. A PNG, I just wanted to point out with a PNG, and you might have noticed this on that little dog photo I was just showing you. If there's a checkered background, that's a PNG. The checkered background means it's transparent, which is really cool because like you could take this bullet hole or shattered glass and like put it over top of another picture and all the checkered areas are just see-through. They disappear. So it means it's a transparent picture. So there's ways in Photoshop to remove the background. And like, so if you wanted a picture of this globe on a t-shirt, you could get rid of the background around the globe and just have the globe on the t-shirt. So it doesn't have the box around it. So that's a cool feature of a PNG. PNGs are also just photo files. Like a lot of your phones save your pictures as PNGs. And then the final one I put up here is a GIF or a GIF. You guys use these all the time, but they can be animated, which is kind of cool. You can put multiple pictures together and create an animation. Okay, and then this one is just talking about color modes. Color modes, like Photoshop works in RGB color mode, which looks a little bit different than a printer's color mode. So your screen, your monitor, and Photoshop use red, blue, and green to create all colors. The printer uses cyan, yellow, and magenta, and black to create all the different colors on the page. They mix and combine those colors to create what your print is printed from. So the only thing you need to be aware of is sometimes your colors might look a little bit different going from your computer screen to a printer. And oftentimes when you print things, they look a little bit darker. So sometimes I overly brighten things just a smidge if I know I'm sending them to be printed. So our printing standard is 300 pixels per square inch. On a printer though, on paper, they call that dots per square inch because it's dots of ink for every inch of ink on a square, for every inch of printed out area on a piece of paper, there's 300 different dots, which is the same as pixels, you know, like the different squares on your screen. So it's the same standard for printing. High quality things need to be at 300. It's just referred to as DPI sometimes. Okay, so your printers work in CMYK, Photoshop's work in RGB, so your colors sometimes just look a little bit different. There are ways to adjust for those, but usually it's not enough that it really bothers me. But just be aware of that. If you work in Illustrator, if you've taken graphic design, Illustrator is in CMYK color mode. It's not in RGB, so it's a little more accurate when you print.